It's great to see you all. My name is Eric Owens. I'm a professor in the theology department and director of the International Studies program here at PC. And we love hosting events that help students think about their vocation and their career and to think about trajectories, especially with regard to foreign affairs. So today it's a real privilege to have two of our terrific faculty members join us to talk about their experience with their careers in foreign affairs along the way. Professor Peter Martin has been a foreign service officer in the State Department, posted in many parts of the world, and he'll describe a little bit about that trajectory along with opportunities for early career people to think about careers in the State Department and adjacent organizations as well. Professor Elizabeth Prodromou is a faculty member here for us in International Studies as well, and she has a really illustrious career working partly in diplomacy with the United States government through the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, but also with a wide variety of NGOs and advocacy groups in foreign affairs space, especially related to religious freedom, but other areas as well, security and politics. Together, they have an enormous amount of experience across sectors, and we've asked them today to come speak to you a little bit about their career trajectory, as well as some ideas that they might have for students coming out of Boston College as to how you might approach careers or think about careers in this field. So I've asked them to speak for 8 to 10 minutes about their pathway through their career and some advice they might have for students to begin with in each case. And then we'll leave the remainder of our time, another 40 minutes, 35, 40 minutes, for just questions from you about what you're interested in, and we'll follow up in detail about there. So welcome to both of you. Thank you so much. Peter, do you mind starting?
Yeah, sure.
Great.
Great to see everyone here. Thanks very much for the invitation to Delphine and others. I don't think I see any of my old students there, so I can use all my old material and won't get called on that. Well, I thought I would talk about how I got into the State Department at first, what kind of brought me there, and a little bit about my career. I should also say before I start, it's great to share the podium with Professor Prodromou and Professor Owens. I think we have such a great department here, a great program, International Studies. I've got it, he didn't come, so I can say I have a son here as a freshman, and I've been trying to tell him that I haven't seen any other program that's so well organized, that really thinks about its students all the time, how to develop them, how to give them opportunities, how to have them think about their futures. And Professor Prodromou I knew from before BC, and amazing authority on so many different issues, so glad to be on the stage with you. So I grew up very close by here, just in Newton Center, sort of near that marathon statue guy on the way to Newton campus. I grew up on that street on the right, and I never really thought about going to BC because it was a great school, but I was wanting to go away from home a little bit. So I went to Georgetown and had a great experience there. Many of you know that Georgetown is a school of foreign service. I was not in that school. I hadn't thought about the foreign service when I was in college yet, when I got there at least. I was studying history and a little bit of theology, and in general I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. But I guess the seed was planted a little bit because I had a lot of friends in SFS in the Foreign Service School, some who were thinking about going to Foreign Service. And maybe a little bit because of that, and a little bit because it was such an exciting time. I graduated in 1990, and the Berlin Wall had just come down, and so there was an opportunity to go and work over in Eastern Europe for a year. They were looking for young Americans to go over and help teach English and do other things like that. And Georgetown had a program that they were starting, basically a student program, to go teach English in what was then Czechoslovakia. So I'd never had the chance to travel outside the US before, so I thought it'd be a great opportunity. So I went and did that. And for me, it was just an amazing, eye-opening experience to be in a culture that was so different, even though European culture may not seem so different to you. This fresh from communism culture was really a shock to the system for me. I was in Eastern Slovakia, which wasn't very cosmopolitan, especially at the time. I was one of only a couple of English speakers that I knew, at least, in the native English speakers in the city. So from that experience, I really became interested in doing more overseas. for me, it was so exciting just to be living in another country and waking up each day and not knowing what you're going to have to do, how you're going to express yourself. I learned mediocre Slovak while I was there, and that was to me just adrenaline every single day when I got up. The other thing was being one of the very few Americans that anyone had ever met over there. I felt like I was really representing my country, even though I wasn't in an official capacity. And I was raised in a family that really valued public service. So when I got back from Slovakia, I started thinking, you know, I might like to be in the Foreign Service and combine this idea of public service, the adrenaline of living overseas, representing your country, and serving your country. So I did a couple other things, but I was sort of on the path to getting into the Foreign Service. I took the Foreign Service exam, which I could talk to you about a little bit later if you'd like. That's kind of a long process. I got a security clearance, and sooner or later I was invited to start in what they call the A100 orientation class of new diplomats. And so it's an exciting time. You're being trained in 8 weeks to become a diplomat, to learn everything you're supposed to know about being a diplomat, which obviously you're not going to know in 8 weeks. It takes, I think, many years of work in the field before you really even know what you're doing, but it's a good start. But it's a very exciting time. Some of those friends of mine from that orientation class, I never served with them in any other posts. We all went to different places, but they still remain some of my good friends because it was that exciting time of learning your new career, and eventually we were all assigned to different countries, and many of us stayed on and learned a language. So my first assignment was Poland. So I was really excited to go back to Eastern Europe, where I had been in Slovakia. There wasn't anything available in Slovakia, but I was excited about Poland. And I was lucky enough to get 6 months of, and this is typical for your first assignment, 6 months of training in Polish to learn Polish language. So imagine that. Imagine getting, I'm not so long out of college, imagine getting paid a full-time wage to learn a language. I mean, it was awesome. It was a great time. Going into work every day, learning Polish, learning about Poland, about the political dynamics that we'd be involved in. So after 6 months of Polish, I was out in the field. I ended up serving in Warsaw. Came back to Washington to work in the peacekeeping office in the main State Department headquarters, in which I worked on. I was liaison to UN peacekeeping operations in Kosovo and Bosnia. So I was back and forth to Kosovo and Bosnia. Did some election observing there. This is as they were working on reconciliation issues after the wars in the 90s. I served at the Vatican, 2 different assignments in the Vatican, covering a host of issues on third countries. Fascinating place to serve, fascinating place to intern if you ever had a chance to get an internship. Our interns there got to do amazing things. It's such a small embassy. I served back in Montreal. I was a public affairs officer in Montreal. And then back in Washington, I was on loan to Congress for 4 years, a diplomat in residence in the House Foreign Affairs Committee. I worked in the International Religious Freedom Office and had some work with Elizabeth at that time. And I might be missing a couple, but it's kind of a whirlwind. But after 23 years, the life is great, but it's also difficult. You're moving from place to place every few years. And towards one of my last assignments, my wife said to me, we were in Italy, and she said to me, you know, Peter, I don't have any more moves I've got left in me, so if you want to stay right here in Rome, that's cool with me. We can go back to Washington, go back to Boston, but moving every so often is just getting to be a killer. And for the kids also, not so easy. My children complained about it a lot, but they got a lot of great experiences out of it. And although my oldest boy who's here, maybe complained the most. Now he's talking about maybe trying to go into Foreign Service himself. So I'll leave it there. for questions, I could talk about the different kinds of jobs in the Foreign Service or anything about the lifestyle, but I'll leave it to Professor Drummond.
Terrific, yeah, thanks so much.
All right, great, thank you. And it's great to be together with you, Peter, too. Professor Owens, Professor Martin, take whatever courses you can with them, they're both geniuses, so, and they didn't pay me to say that, so. It's great to be with you. I'm still kind of a newbie at BC. I came here in January of 2023, and before that I was teaching at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy for 10 years. That's the graduate school of international relations at Tufts University. And I mention that because it's part of my own career trajectory. I'm thrilled to be here at BC. This has become home and I love it. You guys are getting an extraordinary education. It's a really wonderful place to learn how to become a human being in our world today. So I'm really happy to be with you. I also feel like we're on the View, sitting in these chairs. Okay, so just a little bit of personal information. I have a kind of non-traditional set of experiences in terms of foreign policy. The why I got into foreign policy, because we got an email saying talk about why and what. And the why, I guess, is like most people when you choose a career, at least a first career anyway, there's always a personal piece of it. I grew up the grandchild of Greek immigrants on the maternal side and the daughter of an immigrant from Cyprus on the paternal side. My father was born a British colonial subject. My grandparents emigrated from Greece from severe poverty abroad. And so I grew up always thinking about, engaged with what it means to be both American and Greek at the same time, and trying to reconcile those multiple identities. And also having a father who was born a British colonial subject, I grew up with a really healthy, no offense to anyone in here is from the UK, but a healthy disrespect for empires and the damage that empires wreak on human lives around the world. Some of the good things they do, but a lot of the not good things that they do. And so I was always sort of fascinated by this intersection of kind of power, personal agency, and identity, identity similarities and difference. And so I thought, I'll study foreign policy. I didn't think I would become a foreign policy actor. So I went to Tufts as an undergrad. I did 6 years there. I did my master's at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. I would urge any of you who may be thinking about doing a master's in international affairs not to do the sort of straight, undergrad to grad thing, because you'll be 22 sitting in the room with, CFOs and former CIA station chiefs, or, whatever it may be. And although you'll have kind of the academic preparation, you won't get as much out of it as if you had some real world experience. So that's what I did. And then I went to work for 5 years in international banking. And that was great fun. I shopped all the time, like I made gobs of money, and I felt like I was probably gonna not do the things that I really cared about. I made great friends, but I felt like, okay, this isn't exactly the career trajectory for me, although I learned a lot. So I went back to MIT and did a PhD in political science there. And how that took me to foreign policy. Well, I worked on religion and politics, religion democratization in Greece at the time. That was the early mid-90s, and the first kind of direct engagement with the foreign policy apparatus was briefing the new U.S. ambassador to Greece, who's now our U.S. ambassador to China, Nick Burns.
A BC grad.
Yeah, BC grad, right, and a big Red Sox fan too. So I learned about what our ambassadors do when they get posted in country. And so that was an interesting experience there. And from there, then Yugoslavia fell apart. And by then I was at Princeton on a postdoc. And nobody knew much about the Balkans. And I remember being in these State Department meetings with secretaries and undersecretaries working on the Balkans, and also visitors from the Balkans talking to them about history, religion, and politics. And again, encountering what it means to do foreign policy from an outsider's perspective, but having that insider-outsider perspective. And there again, the same kind of things that drove me to think about foreign policy: identity, power, agency, the good that states can do, and then the things that the damage that states do. I was sort of immersed in that in regular briefings to people at the State Department. And then from there I started teaching. And then I was appointed as a U.S. diplomat to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. That's an independent U.S. government agency. It reports to the Congress, the Secretary of State, and the White House on matters of freedom of conscience, belief, and religion around the world. There are 9 private citizens who are commissioners. At the time, we all had diplomatic appointments, and we traveled all over the world investigating violations of freedom of conscience, belief, and religion. And there I got to immerse the machinery of foreign policy at work in the US and abroad. And I learned a lot about decision making and how the foreign policy soup gets stirred. And usually who holds the biggest spoon stirs it the most. And I learned not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I learned that if you want to do good, you have to think usually in incremental ways and not, you have your ideal type, but what you can really accomplish is usually far from that. But not to be discouraged by that, to realize that some good is better than no good at all. So that was I served for 8 years in that diplomatic position and traveled everywhere from China to Saudi Arabia to Russia, multiple times to Saudi, to China, to Russia, and then to China, to Turkey, to Morocco, to U.S. international institutions. I testified before the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, in Brussels, and different international legal contexts. And again, my exposure then, bless you, to foreign policy making in the U.S. and abroad was to see all the different institutional actors play a part in foreign policy making. And I learned that you can be part of the foreign policy apparatus. You can go the FSO route, the Foreign Service Officer route, or there's another track, and Professor Martin can tell you more about that maybe, the civil service track. And then there's the thing that I did, which is a diplomatic appointment, and then these other things. So I regularly brief I've done a lot of briefings to various State Department groups like Population, Refugee, and Migration, the State Department intelligence groups, INR, intelligence and research, the alphabet soup of defense and intelligence agencies that fall under the National Intelligence Council. And again, why that's been interesting for me is, number one, it shows that foreign policy makers are interested in what you're doing, ideas, right? And so that hard line between academic research and practice isn't so hard. It's very porous, and I think that's a good thing. And then secondly, because again, you learn to see sort of where the weight falls in terms of foreign policy making. And so that's what I do. I do a lot of work in foreign policy with practitioners groups, and in particular with women and faith-based engagement, the think tank community here in the US. And I'll close on this. Professor Martin talked about training at the Foreign Service Institute, language training. Both the Foreign Service Institute and also the European External Action Service, which is the equivalent of the Foreign Service Institute for the EU. I do a lot of work with them now on things related to religious literacy and what they need to know about faith-based engagement on everything from delivery of public health services to climate change to gender issues to countering violent extremism to post-conflict reconstruction or reconciliation. So I guess if I were to leave you with anything, it's imagine. Don't imagine there are only a couple of pathways to do foreign policy. Imagine ways that interest you, and think also about security in the broadest sense of the word, in terms of hard security and human security, because those are the things that are at the epicenter of, I think, foreign policy making today in most countries. And I'm at your disposal to talk about any of these things that might be of interest to you.
Thank you so much. Can you just name for students a couple of the think tanks or DC-based institutions you've worked with in some capacity. You don't have to be too detailed, just to put in their minds.
Yeah.
Students may have the names of one or two in mind, but give them a little broader sense of some of the places you
Yeah, so I can give you three off the top of my head. I have a non-resident appointment at the Atlantic Council in Washington in their Eurasia Center. It's a huge, think tank with different programmatic trajectories. That's one. I've worked with the Center for American Progress, CAP, the acronym, and there I worked on a working group with them on religious pluralism in the Middle East, looking at economic development and pluralism in the Middle East. And then I've also had an appointment at the Hudson Institute, which again is a big, pulsing, beautiful building, think tank, and they fall across the political spectrum. So CAP being very progressive, Hudson being more traditionally conservative, and the Atlantic Council being a little bit of both. So if you're interested in the think tank space, I have a list of think tanks that I've shared with my advisees, and I'm happy to share them with you. And one piece of advice I would have about the think tanks is look at, and also think of CFR, Council on Foreign Relations, Foreign Affairs, they publish Foreign Affairs. They always have, every year, a set number of fellowships for undergrads who want to work on foreign policy. But if you see a program on in a particular think tank, talk to any of us or any of your other faculty advisors about the program and who's directing the program, and don't give up if it says, position already filled. Be persistent, be politely persistent in engaging, because sometimes things open up when it appears that they're not there. But if you want like a list of think tanks that I know well, I'll be happy to go over those with you.
Awesome. Okay, terrific. Thank you both so much. I think one of the things that we want to emphasize is there's a lot of pathways to work in foreign affairs, and some will be directly with the United States government, some might be with international organizations, some might be with independent advocacy groups, some might be with bigger think tanks that have, that are sort of quasi-universities in a way, and some are in the academy as well. And this movement among those groups is pretty fluid sometimes, that you don't have to choose 40-year career at the moment you depart school, that there's movement among those different things, and we want to help open your minds to different pathways. It's not simply when you pass the Foreign Service exam or not, but all the different ways that you can lead into that. So let's open up for questions. Really, we want to know what you're thinking about, and you can direct those to either or both of our guests, and let's hear what's on your mind. Do you want to jump in?
I might just, building on what you just said,
Yeah.
I might just say, another thing is there are sometimes NGOs and different groups based overseas where Americans can work. There are a lot of those in Rome, for example, but even in Warsaw, typically in countries where you would need to know the language, then it might be someone with that kind of heritage or Polish heritage is working there. But this community of Sant'Egidio that is a Catholic NGO that works loosely with the Vatican. They've had Americans working over there. They have one key American right now who just graduated from Notre Dame a few years ago. So it's not only the US-based organizations too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, terrific. What questions do you have? Yeah, Adele.
Dr. Prodromou, you spoke to kind of saying you wish you had been a little bit more in the field or worked prior to getting your master's. I think, I don't want to speak for all students, but I do think there is a lot of pressure to kind of finish undergrad, go to grad school, and then decide. So can you speak a little bit more to kind of the advantages you were saying about having that field experience, whether that do be in more international capacities or more domestic ones?
Sure. I think as a general rule, and Professor Owens and Professor Martin, correct me if you think I'm wrong, I think today most graduate programs, if you're doing a master's in international relations or international public policy, something like that, most graduate programs want you now to have 2 to 5 years of experience. I think the advantage of going straight in is the most obvious one, which is it's security, and we're all looking for that, especially when you're 21 or 22 and the world is literally upside down. And it's also an opportunity to kind of deepen what you've already been working on. I think the disadvantages are, again, as I said, I remember sitting in a course at Fletcher, which was on the Middle East, and there was a former CIA station chief from the U.S. Embassy in Iran at the time. You know, and there were mid-career people who were from the finance sector. And so I like read and highlighted and I could say something intelligent, but in terms of actual real world experience, I certainly didn't have that. And it was intimidating, quite honestly. So it kind of, at least for me, I felt like it held me back a little bit because I didn't want to, what's that thing, imposter syndrome? You know, I didn't want to feel like I had that. And then, or I guess I felt like I had it. And then the other thing too is, if you've had a few years of work experience, once you go back to a graduate program, you'll have a much better sense of how to hive off the things that are irrelevant and where you really want to focus your work. And also, quite frankly, you'll be better at networking, because one thing about any graduate program is it's a networking cornucopia, and you should see it that way. And I don't mean that in a negative sense, but everybody is concerned, just like now everyone's concerned with grades. Well, then when you're in grad school, you're concerned with the rest of your life and a job. So use that to network as heavily as you can. And again, if you've been out for, let's say, 2 or 3 years, I think that comes more naturally, you know, and also you'll be a little bit more focused, more efficient in the kind of energy that that you expect. That's not to say don't do it. If you're going to law school, a lot of people go straight in from law school. Or if you're going, I don't know what other professional schools, maybe med school or business school. But even with good B schools, they mostly want you now to have a few years of experience. And I think if you can kind of get over the fear of, you know, the uncertainty of maybe 2 more years before you go back to the kind of certainty and safety of an academic space, it's definitely worth it. Even if it means you have to eat like, rice and mustard, which is what I did through most of grad school.
That's an impressive combination.
Yeah, I worked out well. Mustard goes on everything. So.
Professor Martin.
I could maybe put a little twist on that question. Sometimes students ask me if they're pretty sure they want to try and join the Foreign Service, but they wonder, should they try to join right out of school, or should they take a little time, whether it's to go to grad school or work a little bit. And I think some of the same principles I think Professor Prodromou mentioned hold. I mean, when I didn't tell you everything that I did in my opening remarks, but when I got back from Slovakia, I went to grad school for a little bit, studying history, and then at that point I was pretty sure I did want to join the Foreign Service, but it takes a while. You got to take the test, then you got to wait for the oral exam, then you got to wait for the security clearance. So in between, I taught high school for a couple of years down in Washington, D.C., and I was eating a lot of rice and mustard at that time. But that was, to me, you may not think, oh, teaching high school is a great, necessarily, training for the Foreign Service, but in fact, I think it really was, for various reasons. But anytime you're working and you're in charge of something, you're building skills, and when you go into that job, then, or when you go to grad school, I think you do have a lot more to offer. So I think I was definitely a better diplomat because I had those experiences before I joined. On the other hand, it is true, as I've told some students who come to see me, if you take the Foreign Service exam when you're a senior BC and you pass it, it doesn't hurt to join up. Go ahead and join. You take 2 assignments. Let's say let's say you speak some Spanish. You're assigned to Dominican Republic for 2 years. You really perfect your Spanish. Your second assignment, let's say it's in Angola. They teach you Portuguese. So after 5 years, you have 2 languages pretty fluent. 5 years of experience in the Foreign Service, and then at that point you can decide if you get tenure, which is sort of a jump you get a name. You can decide for yourself: is this a career I really want for my whole career, or maybe that's a great thing to have on your resume, great background that you've given yourself, and you can go on to some things maybe like Professor Prodromou's mentioned or other things. So there's different ways to do things. There's pluses and minuses to all. One young woman who was in my A100 class had just graduated from Georgetown. She was only 21, I think, when we started. And she's still in, and she's had a great career. Could she have been a better diplomat, especially starting, if she'd done something else? maybe, but she's had a good career too.
Mhm. Well, yeah, the important distinction between entering a career after graduating in the State Department and entering a grad program that's really designed toward professional acceleration, you know.
Yeah.
So I can definitely see how important that, the opportunities that come from that is terrific, yeah. What other questions do you have? Yeah.
How did you prepare and study for the FSO test? Like, are there any tips and strategies that you can share with us?
Well, you know, for me, it was a long time ago, but I think the general rule of thumb, and even though the exam has changed a little bit over the years, a fair amount, I think the general rule of thumb still holds, that it's a broad general knowledge that you want to make sure that you have. So I think, you know, maybe a little bit old school, but I think reading the Washington Post and the New York Times regularly, even though of course these days there are many other sources where you can get equally good information, but reading those two sources regularly, to me, prepares you quite well. And you know, you may be surprised, but on the Foreign Service exam, it's not just international affairs and economics. You'll have questions about American culture and history. I mean, for me, I'd done a lot of American history, so that was helpful for me. So I think there are a lot of resources online now to help you get ready for the test, but I would still say that tried and true general rule is something I would advise people.
Great. Is there a question? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Is there any, like, does it matter which type of degree you get as a master's degree? Like, is there a certain benefit to going for an international relations degree as opposed to a law degree in terms of like a foreign service career?
I think, you know, almost any degree is going to prepare you, just prepares you in a different way. Any degree where you're learning how to think, in your undergraduate degree, think critically, write a lot, write concisely, get to the point. I think any degree that's going to help you with those things will help you for a foreign service career. It will also help you, I think, even in the exam process. I would say that you know, there are different specialties within the Foreign Service. So if you want to be an economic officer, for example, then of course an economic degree could be very helpful. But I'll say that one of my good friends in the Foreign Service, who's a BC alumnus, he did not study economics, but he became an economics officer, and he said a lot of what he learned, he felt like he really needed to learn on the job anyway. He studied some economics on the side, but he said, you know, really a lot of it's on the job training. So I'd say, don't get caught up. Do something that you want to do, but do something that's going to help you with those thinking skills, writing skills, and sort of broad-based knowledge. But for Professor Perdomo's background too, you may have different thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important for you to kind of think, if you decide you do want to do foreign policy, or more specifically, go the foreign service route, I think it's important to realize that you can follow what's of real interest and passion for you and still do that. So for example, there's an entire field of science diplomacy now. So let's say, you know, you're like a biochem major, or you do environmental science, that's going to be useful in terms of foreign policy making. There's an entire field of cultural diplomacy. If you're somebody who does, you know, fine arts or cultural heritage or museum science, I mean, that's going to be very useful for you in terms of the foreign service. So that's why I go back to the idea of imagination. Diplomacy now is so broad that there's almost any kind of graduate degree, an area of specialization that can then be applied in the practice of foreign policy. So just be imaginative. Don't close anything out. And one thing I should have said, and I don't have my like transition glasses on, so I missed that on here. One thing that's really important is talk to people. Don't hesitate to reach out and talk to people. Most people are happy to talk to you. I mean, it might take them a while to like schedule an appointment or whatever, but most people are actually nice and will talk to you about their career trajectory. So if you have a question, then ask them, you know, I don't know. I do opera, I'm a first soprano, not I, but for an example. Is that relevant for foreign policy? Yeah, it is for cultural diplomacy. I mean, it's a whole subset fine arts, of cultural diplomacy. So talk to people who do this stuff, and it'll give you a better sense of the whole ecosystem. And then one other thing I wanted to mention is, for those of you who do econ and finance, another space of doing, foreign policy is USAID, U.S. Agency for International Development. There's also the World Bank, which now also, from the stuff I work on a lot, has a whole faith-based section.
One thing I was just going to add, also maybe part of this question, there are these niches within the State Department and related organizations where you can be a subject matter expert, and especially in the civil service that the professor mentions. As a Foreign Service officer, we're also typically generalists, so it's a good thing and a bad thing. I mean, for me, I loved it because I learned so many different things about so many different subjects. The criticism might be you're switching places where you work so often that you don't ever become a super expert on any one thing. You know a lot about many things. But for example, even at the Vatican, I'd be talking to the Vatican about the crisis in Venezuela one day. I'd be talking to a different expert over there about religious freedom in China the next day. Then I would switch. I would move to my assignment, for example, in Poland, and I was learning about Poland-Ukrainian relations, and so it's exciting to learn all these different things, but it's also it's a challenge. You go to a different place and you feel like you got to get up to speed pretty quickly. I guess it's sort of in my DNA now that after a few years I sort of get itchy for a new challenge, so it's exciting.
We hope we can keep you at BC for more than a few years. So we'll try to keep that itch scratched here. What other questions do you have? Yeah.
Professor Warren, I was wondering if during your time in the Foreign Service, if you followed one of those kind of 5 tracks that they show for the different kind of officers, just like consular and economic, and if so, kind of what that entails and what maybe like day-to-day or weekly kind of time at the job looks like.
Yeah, I can answer that, and also I'll give an advertisement for our International Studies course coming up this spring that I'm teaching. I think we called it the U.S. Foreign Service Around the World, in which we'll go into depth on all the different cones, we call them, and we've got some great Foreign Service officers who are going to either join us in person or Zoom in. So that's my public service announcement.
It's on my list to have you both promote your classes for the spring, so good, you check that box.
So I ended up teaching at the time I was joining. You passed the exam, and then you had to tell them which cone you wanted to be in, which of these specialties. And I was sort of torn between political division, political cone, public diplomacy I thought would be really interesting, and consular. The consular division, those are the people who help American citizens overseas if you lose your passport, if you get arrested, God forbid. They also deal with visa issues. And most Foreign Service officers spend at least some time doing a consular tour. When I was in Poland, I did a year in consular. So I visited some Polish prisons. Never thought I would be doing that, visiting American citizens who were incarcerated in these Polish prisons, make sure that they were doing okay. I did a lot of visa work too, which was very good for my Polish language skills. But in the end, I chose the political cone. Everyone I talked to said the political cone was really where the action is, and I think that, I'm biased, but I think that it's true that the political cone typically deals with the hottest issues in country. You're going to be dealing with host government on all kinds of political cooperation issues. For example, when I was in Poland, my job in my second year, my job was, even as a first tour officer, I was reporting on Polish politics, and Poland was about to join NATO at that time. So I was reporting a lot of those issues, writing reports back to Washington, to the State Department, to CIA, Congress, anyone who was interested about these issues. And I was also reporting on and meeting people to learn about especially Polish-Ukrainian relations, Polish-Russian relations, because a lot of these dynamics we're seeing right now, the same dynamics we had back then. It was a really interesting time to be working on those issues. And the thing I love about the Foreign Service is that, partially because of the timeline and the pressure you're under, to get information back to decision makers. The best way to do that and the best way to get up-to-date information is to talk to people, be out making contacts, dealing with authorities on the subject matter wherever you are. So my old boss in Poland, the ambassador, was Dan Fried, who was a career foreign service officer, amazing diplomat. And at one point he came into the political section where we were working, and there were a bunch of us there doing something, and he said to us, "What are you guys doing here?" And it was the middle of the day, and we were working hard. And we were like, "Sir?" And he said, "If you're just going to be sitting in the office, you could be sitting back in Washington. You can get Polish newspapers back in Washington. Even then, you get them online. Something maybe at that time. You could be calling up people to find out what's going on." He said, "You're here. The U.S. government's paying for you to be here, so you can go out and meet people, make contacts, talk to people, find out what's really happening. Things that you're not going to read about in the newspapers." And even though I think we're getting out and doing some of that, you said yes, heard the ambassador, and we all ran out trying to find someone to talk to really fast. And that was what I love about the Foreign Service, making these connections, talking to these Polish think tanks who had their opinions about what was happening in Russia and Ukraine. So the political code, you do a lot of those types of things, dealing with the foreign government authorities, but also with others on the ground. Consular, I think, is very interesting code too. You're really the core of why we have an embassy overseas, to help U.S. citizen interests. And one of the reasons I like public diplomacy, I did one tour on public diplomacy, because you can do tours out of cone too. I was a political officer, but I did some consular work and I did some public diplomacy. Public diplomacy, you're dealing with the media, you're setting up or giving yourself interviews, trying to further U.S. interest, explain U.S. policy to a foreign audience. You might be dealing with universities or other cultural institutions. I think the professor was mentioning too, these kinds of jobs overseas. You might be organizing a visit by a U.S. jazz musician to come over to Poland or another country to just share U.S. culture with another country, to show common ground. In Poland, even though I was a political officer, one of my fondest memories is I was out just on a vacation in the outskirts of Poland, of Warsaw, pretty far outside of Warsaw, with some friends, and we happened to stop at this festival they had. And of course, being a good diplomat, I went and introduced myself with my friends to the organizers, and they said, "Oh, well, you should speak to the festival here." And there was hundreds of people there, so I hadn't prepared anything, and so I had to get up and give a little impromptu speech in Polish about U.S.-Poland relations to this group. So I'm glad that's not on tape like you're taping here. But the Poles loved it. They loved hearing they didn't care about some grammatical mistakes I might have made. They loved it. All these people swarmed us afterwards, and it's about creating goodwill to try to help create cooperation between peoples. That's what public diplomacy is all about. So I'll stop there. I went on too long, but there are other cones if you're interested. We can talk another time.
Great. Other questions? Yeah, Kendall.
So thank you for talking. It's so informative and really interesting to hear about your careers. So I feel like the summer is such a great opportunity to really as an undergrad especially dip your feet into different career paths. So I was wondering, as someone that's interested in pursuing a career in the foreign service, if you had any recommendations for pursuing internships or fellowship opportunities, especially in the summer.
Sure. I know Professor Prodromou has some good ideas too. I'll mention just briefly. I've had, I guess I alluded to, I've always had interns. I started intern programs at embassies where we didn't already have them. And I think if you can get an internship, a State Department internship, they're very competitive for the summer, less competitive for if you could take a semester off and do one. But I mean, anyone who's interned with the embassy overseas or back in the main state, if you've done that, you know a lot more than I did when I was starting as a diplomat. I never had that opportunity, and so those things are great. But if you can't do that, or if you, for whatever reason, you don't want to, I think a lot of these organizations that Professor Prodromou mentioned, you're still really gaining a lot of great insight into foreign policy generally, and into issues even if you're working domestically. And all those things could be useful. Again, I think it comes back to not just the knowledge, but critical thinking, writing, public speaking.
Yeah, the other thing, if you're gonna try to get an internship at an embassy, the one thing I would urge you to do is, if you have language skills, really foreground language skills. It's really important, and it's a competitive advantage.
Yeah, I think the State Department formal internship program application has passed recently
Yeah.
for work in DC at the department next summer. But as you said, there are some other opportunities around as well. If you go to, careers.state.gov,
Yeah.
has their formal internship stuff. They also have online internships for the semesters that students can do. And that's true with multiple government agencies. So if you go to, jobs.usa.gov, that has a listing of government positions across departments, and that might mean commerce or justice or the EPA or other things that can help you get involved in national and international policy. And those are all ongoing and not at the same time as state, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, and I might just also add, kind of occurred to me as during while we were talking, keep in mind also faith-based organizations like Catholic Relief Services. BC has a great relationship with the Jesuit Refugee Service. I'm not sure how many internships they have, but these are big organizations that have a lot to offer too. CRS, the head of CRS has great BC connections. His son is here, and he's got great BC, great appreciation for BC. And the long time, my old boss at the Vatican was the longtime head of CRS, Ken Hackett from BC. So.
Yeah, work the BC networks if you're looking for things, use Handshake. If you're related to International Studies program in any way, as a major or minor, join our LinkedIn group where we have several hundred alumni, many of whom are working in the State Department or foreign policy type things to use as a connector. BC's Handshake, Equal Exchange, all that stuff. Those are really useful. I know it can feel overwhelming because there's so many people, but this is, they're useful tools. Was there a question back to that?
Yeah, it was kind of similar. It was just kind of like, as like kind of sophomore, like kind of younger, like not knowing masters, what's your general advice for like getting started in the field? Like, I don't really know a lot about it yet, so like if I were to be interested in more, like what would you advise me to do?
Yeah, I mean, if you're, in terms of your major, or in terms of career?
SIS.
Oh,
Yeah. So
yeah,
like
okay.
just like how to get started.
Yeah, I would think, begin thinking really carefully about your concentrations, and then maybe think about internships that are related to those concentrations. But having said that, any internship you get is going to be useful for your IS major, and your IS major is going to be useful for any internship. Go to the sites that Professor Owens just mentioned. If you know there's an NGO that you're really interested in, ask one of us. Do you know anybody who works there? There's nothing better than a nice email that says, do you have time to speak to, or, can you give some guidance? That's really important. So I would think about that. And then also, if you're interested, think about the sectors in which you're interested, and again, talk to some of us. We can tell you sort of platforms to look at that will have internships that will be really important. One thing that kind of keeps coming up, but we haven't really focused on it, is media. So both, old and new forms of media, and anybody in here who's working on AI issues, that's hugely important in terms of the present and future of diplomacy. So think about, if you have any particular sector that might be interested, but check those websites, talk to us, do your homework. That's a big piece of advice I have to you. Look at a think tank and get to know who's on there and what kind of programs, because that might lead you back to a personal connection. And yes, the BC Alumni Network, alums want to help alums. I mean, they really do. So I would urge you to sort of, again, do some homework on LinkedIn and see maybe if there's a BC alumnus or alumna who you want to reach out to.
I'd also add that keep in mind that, especially now in the US, we've got so many people from so many different cultures here in the US. I was just, our parish in West Roxbury, we adopted a family that had just been settled as refugees from Congo. And I thought, oh, this will be great. I speak some French. I'll be able to help them out. And they came in. Turned out they'd been in a refugee camp in Congo. The father had lived almost his whole life in the refugee camp. He'd been there for over 20 years. But they were not French speakers. They were from a different part of Africa. They were Swahili speakers. And just in getting to know them and helping them, it wasn't just doing good, but it was also such an education. And I didn't know much about the area he was from originally. Certainly I learned a lot about some of the struggles he had as a refugee coming to Boston. And there are so many different examples of that. And if you go to Catholic Charities, for example, in Boston, they have volunteer opportunities with refugees. If you're home for the summer and wherever you live, I don't think there are too many places in the United States now that wouldn't have opportunities like that. And those are, if I were hiring for an internship in the foreign service or anything like that, I would be impressed, and I would want to have someone who had those kind of experiences as a student.
The other thing, this just jogged my memory. Think about your home city, wherever it may be. If there are consular offices there, they're always looking for interns. And so getting experience working for consulate X, whatever it may be.
For a foreign consulate.
Yeah, for a foreign consulate. They're always looking for interns. So that could be a really useful experience. They oftentimes don't pay, but still you'll get your foot in the door and you'll see what the daily workings of a consulate are like. They oftentimes need help doing program planning, guest speakers, etc. So you see that intersection again of formal diplomacy and informal diplomacy. So that's another thing to consider. And if you're interested in faith-based engagement, I have like a gazillion contacts in that space, so I'm happy. And also in particular on women in international security and women in faith-based engagement, I'd be happy to share those.
Yeah, I'd also mention, that if you're studying abroad, consider the opportunities to do volunteer work or to do an internship abroad. Some of BC's study abroad programs have internships built into them. You won't be able to be paid usually, but there'll be volunteer work, and you can also simply volunteer outside of that. That provides really important cultural exchange and work experience and things that you work on your language skills. I also would say that it's really an important thing to have on the ground experience at different parts. So it's one thing to study migration, it's another to work with refugees in your hometown, or to do an immersion trip where you're working with people at the border, or the US southern border, for example, or take opportunities to put yourself in places where you have real encounters and you're experiencing the lives of real people, not as policy problems, but as human beings in need, or human beings with challenging different approaches than yours, etc. That's really informative, and you can speak to that in job interviews, but most importantly, it shapes who you are. The other thing I'll mention is working with faculty here. There are research opportunities to work with faculty to help on programs, like Professor Kadavar works on a program on Iran. Professor Krause has a political violence project he works on. A number of other faculty have 1 or 2 undergraduate research assistants at a time to work on programs. And sometimes students can be too quick to grasp on this, as if that's like the thing that will make you have a CV item or something. I'm suggesting more that, like, if you're engaged in the work that they're doing, that can be an interesting experience. And that if you get to know faculty members, many of us have relationships outside of the university, of course, that can help you think about placements and opportunities, sort of vocational conversations, as well as network effects along the way. So invest your time here at BC. This is a rare opportunity to be with such terrific faculty and other people. The faculty have a lot of interest as well and can help you find opportunities outside of BC during school and after school as well. Let's do one last question, and then we'll let people go, and you can stick around for a little bit to talk to our speakers if we need to. Yeah.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
that's good. I just following what you said, just wanted to emphasize again, Professor Perdomo said to be persistent, and what you said about looking for volunteer opportunities overseas. I advised one student at one point. I'd gotten him in contact with an organization in France while he was going to be there. Good kid, and he sent an email. It was GRS contact. Sent an email. Maybe he sent 2 emails, and I think he thought he didn't want to be too pushy, but he never heard back from the guy. Didn't try to call, and there is a balance. People are busy. You don't want to be too pushy, but I finally got an email back from the contact later on saying, hey, whatever happened to that kid? And I said, well, I think he tried to email you, but he didn't get through. And he checked his email. Oh, yeah, it was such a busy time. So obviously, use your common sense. Don't be a pest. But sometimes when you shoot an email out there, it can be like throwing it into the sea. You need to at least talk to someone live at the organization. Say, hey, don't want to bother her, miss whoever, but just wanted to make sure she'd received this because I'm interested in helping if there's a possibility. So sorry.
Terrific.
Polite persistence.
Yeah. Good, yeah.
In your experience, how does the passion and your focus tend to differ between working for the U.S. government versus like an NGO, think tank, or
The passion and
the focus is in like how do you view problems, I guess.
well, I think it'd be hard. I think it'd be hard to generalize because people have their motivations and passions in different ways. It is. I think it is as a foreign service officer. It's a very particular job in that you're nonpartisan politically. So certainly, I think we almost all share a passion for promoting. I think what I would call promotion of human dignity, which is part of U.S. foreign policy. We're not always perfect in doing it, but I think that that's the ideal that we try to promote. I think that there's a lot of passion there. There's passion for representing your country. I think the politics can be difficult sometimes because sometimes you might not agree with the policy, and you're still going to have a passion for doing the right thing, and maybe you don't think the policy that you're obliged to promote is the right thing. So I think that can create some difficulties. I think there's a longer answer to that too, but that's my short answer.
Yeah, I think in terms of foreign policy and foreign service, the term service is really important. So if you do go into the foreign service, you're serving your country. And I mean, that's something to always keep in mind. And, you know, we talk here at BC a lot about formation and about service. And so I think that fits very neatly. But I would also encourage you to think about you're also serving humanity. I mean, I know it may sound corny, but regardless of how far up the food chain you get in the decision-making structure, at the end of the day, you're part of decisions that really affect people's lives, and oftentimes they affect it in terms of life or death. And so sometimes it might feel like you're a cog in a big machine, but you can still follow your passion even as one of those cogs. And I would urge you to never lose sight of that. At the end of the day, whatever pathway you choose, service is really about other people, helping other people. And it's easy to forget that when, you know, you're like in Boston where your apartment costs $6,000 a month and the heat doesn't work half the time, or, you know, wherever you may be. Or you're like, you know, in a country where there's a coup and you're fearful for your life, whatever it may be. At the end of the day, the work that you do, the passion you bring to it, I think if you stay focused on the human dimension, it will keep you going, it'll give you energy. At some of the times when you feel drained, and you'll know that you really did everything you could to do good in this world at a time when I think the world is desperately in need of all of us trying to do good.
Well, that's a terrific and profound way to end our conversation. Thank you both for your time. Thank you all for being here. Reminder to sign up for the IS newsletter, even if whether or not you're an IS major or minor, you can get all kinds of info about career events like this and other things. Professor Prodromou is teaching 2 classes in the spring.
Yeah, I'm teaching democratization in the Middle East in the spring to 2 people in that class, and I'm teaching a senior seminar on geopolitics, religion, security. Next year I'll be teaching a course on religion, politics in Turkey, and a course on religion and U.S. foreign policy.
And Professor Martin is teaching in the spring.
Yeah, I'm teaching U.S. Foreign Service around the world. So it's Tuesdays and Thursdays. I think it'll be a great course. But I've had Dr. Prodromou as a guest speaker in my class, and that's always, when I look at the evaluations at the end, they're like, Dr. Prodromou was great.
More
She was
Prodromou.
great. But what about me?
This is great. They're all listed.